The scent of antiseptic and stale waiting room coffee would forever be burned into Izuku Midoriya's memory. At 4 years old, the world was a canvas of infinite, brilliant possibilities, painted in the bright, primary colors of heroes and villains. For Izuku, the absolute center of this vibrant universe was All Might. He sat on the stiff, vinyl-covered chair of the clinic's waiting room, his legs far too short to reach the linoleum floor, kicking back and forth in a frantic, rhythmic tempo of pure excitement. In his small, pudgy hands, he tightly gripped a limited edition Silver Age All Might action figure. He twisted the plastic waist back and forth, imagining the hero delivering a devastating Texas smash to an invisible evildoer. Izuku, sweetie, try to sit still, Inko Midoriya whispered gently, though the warm smile on her face betrayed her own excitement. She reached out, brushing a wild tuft of dark green hair out of her son's enormous, sparkling eyes. The doctor will call us back any minute now. You don't want to use up all your energy before we even find out what your quirk is, do you? I can't help it, Mom. Izuku beamed, his voice a high-pitched squeak of pure joy. What if it's a super-strength quirk? Or what if I can breathe fire like Dad, but I can also pull things to me like you, so I make fire tornadoes? Kaken already got his quirk, and it's so cool, but mine is gonna be cool too, right? Of course it will be, Izuku, Inko said softly, her heart swelling with a mother's fierce love. Whatever it is, it will be perfectly yours. The heavy wooden door to the back hallway clicked open, and a nurse in pastel scrubs stepped out, holding a clipboard. Midoriya Izuku? Dr. Garaki will see you now, Izuku gasped, practically launching himself off the chair. He grabbed his mother's hand, pulling her toward the doorway with a strength that surprised her. This was it. The moment his origin story began, every great hero had a beginning. All Might had one. Endeavor had one. Katsuki Bakugo had one. And now, on a mundane Tuesday afternoon in a sterile Tokyo clinic, Izuku Midoriya was about to get his. The exam room was cold. The walls were lined with anatomical charts, displaying the complex, newly evolved biology of the superhuman society. Dr. Garaki, a stout, bald man with thick, opaque goggles, sat on a rolling stool. He didn't look up immediately, his pen scratching against a thick manila folder. Sit down, the doctor murmured, gesturing to the examination table. Inko lifted Izuku onto the crinkling paper covering the padded table. Izuku clutched his all-might figure tightly to his chest, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Dr. Garaki finally turned, pushing his goggles up slightly. He didn't have the warm, comforting bedside manner typical of pediatricians. He looked at Izuku not as a child full of dreams, but as an anomaly, a biological misstep. Well, Mrs. Midoriya, the doctor began, his voice dry, devoid of any inflection. I have the results of the X-rays and the genetic sequencing. And? Inko leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Is it a delayed manifestation? He's nearly 5. And most of the children in his kindergarten class have already shown signs of their abilities. Dr. Garaki sighed, reaching up to rub the bridge of his nose. He reached over to a light box mounted on the wall and snapped it on, sliding a stark black and white X-ray film under the clips. It was an image of a small, childlike foot. You should probably give it up, the doctor said. The words hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Izuku stopped swinging his legs. The plastic All Might slipped a fraction of an inch in his suddenly slack grip. He stared at the doctor, his large green eyes uncomprehending. Give it up? He echoed, his voice barely a whisper. What do you mean? Inko demanded, her maternal instincts instantly flaring, a defensive edge sharpening her tone. Give what up? Is there something wrong with him? Not wrong, Peresi. Just obsolete, Dr. Garaki explained, tapping the X-ray with the back of his pen. In the early days of the superhuman emergence, researchers found a highly reliable biological marker to determine if a person would develop a quirk. It all comes down to the pinky toe. He tapped a specific joint on the X-ray. When the human race began to evolve quirks, the body underwent minor anatomical streamlining to accommodate the new genetic information. One of the first things to go was the extra joint in the pinky toe. A person with a quirk has a single, fused joint there. But if you look at Izuku's X-ray, Izuku followed the doctor's pen. Even at his young age, he could see what the man was pointing at. Two distinct joints. Izuku has two joints, Dr. Garaki concluded, turning off the light box with a harsh click. It's a relic of a bygone evolutionary era. He lacks the plus alpha genetic sequence entirely. He will never develop a quirk. He is, by all scientific definitions, quirkless. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a vacuum, of all the air, hope, and light being sucked out of the room. Izuku didn't cry immediately. The concept was too massive, too devastating for his 4-year-old brain to process all at once. It was as if the doctor had casually informed him that gravity no longer applied to him, or that the sun would not rise tomorrow. Quirkless. The word tasted like ash. It meant he was different. It meant he was normal in a world where normal was a defect. He slowly raised his head, looking past the doctor, staring blankly at the wall. The All Might figure slipped from his hands, hitting the linoleum floor with a hollow, plastic clatter. "I see," Inko whispered, her voice trembling. She reached over, her hand shaking as she gently touched her son's knee. Thank you, doctor." The drive home was a blur of passing street lights and gray concrete. The rain had started to fall, smearing the world outside the car window into gloomy streaks of neon and shadow. Izuku sat in his car seat, staring at his hands. They looked the same as they had this morning. But they weren't. They were empty. They would always be empty. When they got home, the apartment felt massive and hollow. Izuku didn't speak. He walked mechanically to his bedroom, a shrine dedicated to the symbol of peace. Posters of All Might adorned every wall, smiling down at him with 1,000 confident grins. Before today, those smiles were a promise. Now, they felt like a mockery. He climbed into the computer chair, his tiny fingers reaching for the mouse. He clicked the familiar bookmark, bringing up the video he had watched 1,000 times. The disaster footage from a toxic spill, the fires roaring, the sirens wailing, the sheer chaos of a world falling apart. And then, the booming laughter. "It's fine now." "Why?" "Because I am here." All Might stepped out of the flaming wreckage, holding a half-dozen civilians across his massive shoulders, his smile unbroken, his spirit unshattered. The door to the bedroom creaked open. Inko stood in the doorway, tears streaming silently down her face. She looked at her son, bathed in the blue light of the monitor, watching the impossible. Izuku slowly turned the chair around. His eyes were wide, brimming with unshed tears, his lower lip trembling uncontrollably. He pointed a shaking finger at the screen. "Mom!" His voice broke, a fragile, agonizing sound. He saves everyone with a smile. No matter what, he never gives up. Can I be a hero too?" It was the critical juncture. The moment that, in another universe, would define Izuku's lifelong inferiority complex. Inko ran to him, dropping to her knees, pulling his small, fragile body into a desperate embrace. "I'm sorry, Izuku. I'm so sorry," she wailed, burying her face in his shoulder. She was apologizing. She was mourning his dream. Izuku felt the tears finally spill over, hot and bitter against his cheeks. He hugged his mother back, burying his face in her hair. But as the minutes ticked by, as the video looped in the background with All Might's booming laughter filling the silence, something shifted in the boy's mind. He looked at his hands again, draped over his mother's back. "I'm sorry." Why was she sorry? It wasn't her fault. It wasn't his fault. It was just an extra joint in a toe. Did an extra bone mean he couldn't run? Did it mean he couldn't think? Did it mean he couldn't throw a punch, or save someone from a fire? All Might had a quirk, yes. But All Might also had muscles. He had a brain. He had courage. Izuku stopped crying. The tears dried on his face, leaving tight, salty tracks. He gently pushed back from his mother's embrace. Inko looked at him, her eyes red and puffy, confused by the sudden change in his demeanor. "Mom," Izuku said, his voice startlingly steady for a child whose world had just collapsed. "Don't say sorry." Izuku? "Don't say sorry," he repeated, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He turned back to the glowing screen, staring at the symbol of peace. "I don't have a quirk. The doctor said so." But But All Might doesn't save people just because he can punch hard. He saves people because he knows how to save them. He's smart. He's strong. Izuku hopped down from the chair. He walked over to his toy box, picked up the dropped All Might figure, and held it tightly. If I don't have a quirk, Izuku declared, his 4-year-old eyes burning with an unnatural, terrifyingly intense fire, then I just have to be smarter and stronger than everyone who does. The sun was blindingly bright the next day at the neighborhood playground. It was a sprawling oasis of sandboxes, jungle gyms, and swings, bordered by tall oak trees. Usually, the playground was a kingdom, and Katsuki Bakugo was its undisputed king. Katsuki, with his spiky ash-blonde hair and a permanent scowl that somehow looked natural on a kindergartner's face, stood at the center of the sandbox. Small, crackling sparks, resembling miniature fireworks, popped in the palms of his hands. He was demonstrating his newly manifested quirk, Explosion, to a captive audience of awestruck peers. Whoa, Katsuki, that's so cool! A boy with small, leathery bat wings on his back cheered. You're definitely gonna be a hero, another boy, whose fingers could stretch like rubber, added. Probably even better than All Might. Katsuki puffed out his chest, a cocky grin spreading across his face. Obviously. I'm the strongest one here. I'm gonna go to Yui High School, and I'm gonna be the #1 hero in the whole world. Nobody's gonna stand in my way. He glanced around his court, his crimson eyes scanning the playground. They settled on a familiar figure sitting on the edge of the swings, unusually quiet. Izuku sat with a notebook on his lap, a brand new, spiral-bound notebook Inko had bought him that morning. He was furiously scribbling with a thick crayon, drawing rudimentary stick figures of Katsuki creating explosions, attempting to calculate the blast radius based on the size of his friend's palms. Katsuki marched over, the winged boy and the rubber-fingered boy trailing behind him like loyal henchmen. Hey, Deku! Katsuki barked, using the nickname he had given Izuku months ago. Initially, it meant wooden figure or good for nothing, born from Izuku's struggle to read the kanji of his own name. What are you doing over there? Why aren't you looking at my quirk? Izuku looked up, blinking. He closed the notebook. I was looking, Kaken. I was drawing it. Your sweat glands are mutated, right? That's what your mom said. You sweat something like nitroglycerin. Katsuki blinked, slightly derailed by the big words. Yeah? Duh. So what? Did you go to the doctor yesterday? Did you finally get your quirk? It better not be something lame. The playground seemed to go quiet. The other children leaned in, eager for the gossip. Izuku stood up from the swing. He didn't look down at his shoes. He didn't shrink into his shoulders. He looked Katsuki dead in the eye. I don't have one, Izuku said, his voice clear and resonant. The doctor said I'm quirkless. I have an extra joint in my toe. A collective gasp echoed from the peanut gallery. Quirkless? The winged kid mocked, a cruel smirk twisting his face. You mean you're just a normal? You don't have any powers at all? That's so pathetic. The rubber-fingered kid laughed, pointing a stretched-out, elongated finger at Izuku. You're practically a baby. How are you supposed to hang out with us if you don't even have a quirk? Katsuki, we shouldn't let him play heroes and villains anymore. He can't even be a sidekick. Izuku's fists clenched at his sides. He opened his mouth to defend himself, to regurgitate the logic he had discovered last night, that he could train, that he could learn. But before Izuku could utter a single syllable, the air temperature around them spiked. Boom! A deafening explosion erupted right next to the rubber-fingered boy's ear. The shockwave sent him tumbling backward into the dirt, screaming in terror. The winged boy shrieked, scrambling away as Katsuki stood between them and Izuku, smoke rolling off his palms. His crimson eyes narrowed into feral slits of pure rage. Shut your damn mouths! Katsuki roared, his voice cracking with childish fury. The playground froze. Izuku stared at Katsuki's back in shock. Katsuki stomped forward, grabbing the winged kid by the collar of his shirt, sparks threatening to ignite his clothes. Who said you get to decide who plays with us, huh? Who the hell do you think you are? Be but Katsuki. The boy stammered, tears welling in his eyes. He's quirkless. He's a Deku. He's useless. He's my Deku, you extra. Katsuki bellowed, throwing the boy to the ground. He turned to face the terrified children, pointing an accusatory, smoking finger at them. Listen to me. I'm the strongest. I'm the best. Which means I'm gonna be the greatest hero ever. He turned around, marching back to Izuku. He stopped inches away from the green-haired boy, grabbing him by the shoulders. Katsuki's grip was tight, almost painful, but there was no malice in it. There was only a twisted, possessive, burning determination. You don't have a quirk? Katsuki demanded, glaring into Izuku's eyes. No, Izuku said softly, his heart pounding. Fine. Katsuki shouted, loud enough for the whole park to hear. If you don't have a quirk, you're weak. And if you're weak, that means I have to protect you. Because a real hero protects the weak. Katsuki let go of Izuku's shoulders and jabbed a thumb into his own chest. You're smart, Deku. You know all about quirks and all that nerd crap. So here's the deal. Since you don't have a quirk, you're gonna be the guy who tells me where to punch. You're my sidekick. And nobody messes with my sidekick. Got it? Izuku stared at Katsuki. The logic was completely backwards. It was arrogant, it was egotistical, and it was entirely missing the point of what Izuku wanted to be. Katsuki wasn't seeing him as an equal. He was seeing him as an extension of his own greatness, a piece of property that belonged to him, and therefore had to be defended at all costs. But Katsuki had defended him. When the world told Izuku he was obsolete, when the other kids saw him as a target, Katsuki had stepped in. He had drawn a line in the sand. He hadn't rejected him. He had just changed the rules of their game. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Izuku's face. The tension left his shoulders. He didn't care about Katsuki's giant ego. He didn't care about being called a sidekick right now. All he cared about was that he wasn't alone. Got it, Kaken, Izuku said, nodding firmly. I'll tell you exactly where to punch. Katsuki smirked, a vicious, triumphant look. He turned back to the trembling extras on the ground. You hear that? If anyone picks on Deku, they answer to me. Now get out of my sandbox before I blow you to pieces. The other boys scattered like frightened mice. From that day forward, the dynamic between Katsuki Bakugo and Izuku Midoriya was set in stone. It was a bizarre, codependent, intensely competitive relationship. Because Katsuki made it violently clear that Izuku was under his protection, the bullying that should have defined Izuku's childhood never materialized. Without the constant fear of physical assault, without the daily psychological torment of being told he was worthless, Izuku's personality blossomed in an entirely different direction. He didn't shrink into corners. He didn't stutter when spoken to. He didn't hide his notebooks. Instead, Izuku weaponized his intellect. 2 weeks after the diagnosis, Inko Midoriya found herself sitting in the small, Spartan office of a local community center dojo. Across the desk sat a grizzled, heavily scarred man in a traditional white gi. His name was Sensei Tanaka, a former pro hero whose career had been cut short by a villain attack that shattered his left leg. Now, he taught traditional Kodokan Judo. He's very young, Mrs. Midoriya, Tanaka rumbled, sipping from a cup of green tea. Most children start at 6 or 7. 5 is pushing it. The discipline required, the physical toll, it's not a playground. I know, Inko said, her voice firm. She glanced through the paper screen door, watching her son sitting in seiza on the tatami mats, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the older students practicing their throws. But Izuku, he's different. He recently found out he's quirkless. Tanaka's thick eyebrows rose. He set his teacup down. I see. And you want him to learn self-defense so he doesn't get picked on? No, Inko corrected, a small, proud smile touching her lips. He has a friend who makes sure he doesn't get picked on. Izuku wants to learn judo because he told me yesterday, and I quote, if I can't break through a wall with a punch, I need to know how to use the wall's weight against itself. Tanaka chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound in his chest. A 5-year-old said that? He reads a lot, Inko sighed. He's analyzing everything. He watches pro hero fights, breaks down their center of gravity, their leverage points. He needs an outlet, sensei. If he doesn't have a quirk to train, he needs to train his body. Will you take him? Tanaka looked back out at the boy on the mats. We'll see how he handles his first fall. If he cries and quits, I keep the deposit. Izuku did not cry. His first lesson was entirely about yukimi, the art of falling. For 2 hours, Tanaka threw the small boy onto the mat. Over and over again, slapping the mat to distribute the kinetic energy, tucking his chin to protect his skull, rolling with the momentum instead of fighting it. It was agonizing. Izuku's tiny body ached, his skin stung, and his muscles screamed. But every time he hit the mat, he remembered the doctor's cold eyes. He remembered the X-ray. He remembered Katsuki declaring him a sidekick. I'm not a sidekick, Izuku thought, slapping the mat fiercely as he rolled back to his feet, breathing heavily. I'm going to be a hero. My quirk is me. By the time he was 7, Izuku was a terror on the tatami mats. He couldn't overpower the older, larger kids, especially those with minor enhancement quirks, but he didn't need to. He was a ghost. He memorized their tells. The way a boy's left shoulder dipped before he lunged, the way a girl favored her right leg when shifting weight. Izuku would step into their guard, grab their lapels, and use their own momentum to send them flying through the air with a flawless ippon-si nage, one-arm shoulder throw. And while Izuku mastered leverage and gravity in the dojo, he mastered agility on the streets with Katsuki. Katsuki's explosion quirk was developing rapidly. By the time they were 8, Katsuki realized he could use the recoil of his blasts to propel himself forward, vaulting over fences and launching himself onto the low roofs of storage sheds. Keep up, Deku! Katsuki would yell, laughing maniacally as he blasted himself over a chain-link fence, leaving a trail of smoke. Izuku, standing on the other side, didn't pout. He didn't complain that it wasn't fair. He narrowed his eyes, analyzing the height of the fence, the angle of the crossbars, and his own running speed. If Katsuki could fly, Izuku had to learn how to climb. He discovered parkour through an underground hero forum online. The discipline of moving from point A to point B as efficiently as possible, using the human body's natural biomechanics to overcome obstacles. Izuku began training his grip strength, his core, and his spatial awareness. He stopped walking on sidewalks. He balanced on curbs, walked along the tops of brick walls, leaped over fire hydrants. His knees and elbows were in a constant state of being scraped and bandaged, much to Inko's dismay, but she never stopped him. She saw the light in his eyes. When Katsuki blasted over a fence, Izuku sprinted at it. He used a technique called a tic-tac, kicking off the vertical surface of an adjacent wall to gain upward momentum, grabbing the top of the fence, and smoothly vaulting over in one fluid motion, rolling as he hit the ground to absorb the shock. He popped up right next to a startled Katsuki. Took you exactly 1.4 seconds longer than me, Kaken, Izuku said, checking a digital stopwatch strapped to his wrist, a smirk dancing on his lips. You're telegraphing your right hand too much. If you alternate your blasts, you'll reduce aerodynamic drag and shave a half-second off your launch time, Katsuki growled, little explosions popping in his hands. Shut up, nerd. I don't need aerodynamic crap. I need more firepower. Race you to the bridge. You're on. They were an oddity in their neighborhood. The explosive prodigy and the quirkless acrobat. They fought, they bickered, they competed in everything from math tests to foot races. Katsuki won the physical contests 9 times out of 10, his quirk providing an insurmountable advantage in sheer power and speed. But Izuku won the tactical battles. He won at chess. He won at strategy games. He aced the theoretical exams. Because nobody bullied Izuku, he was never isolated. He learned how to talk to people. He learned how to read a room. He became highly charismatic in a clinical, intensely focused way. He wasn't the loudest kid in the room, that was Katsuki, but when Izuku spoke, people listened. Because Izuku was almost always right. The true test of this new Izuku Midoriya came during his final year of elementary school, at age 10. It was a brisk autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning fiery shades of orange and red, crunching under the sneakers of the students leaving Aldera Elementary. Izuku was walking home alone, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Katsuki had stayed behind for a special advanced mathematics tutoring session. Katsuki absolutely refused to let Izuku have a higher grade than him in any subject, even if it meant taking extra classes. Izuku was currently immersed in his latest notebook, Hero Analysis for the Future, Volume 4. He was meticulously sketching the support gear of the newly debuted R-rated hero, Midnight, theorizing the chemical composition of her somnambulous perfume, and how a localized air current manipulator could counter it. Hey! You! Izuku stopped walking. He didn't look up immediately. He finished his sentence, capped his pen, and slowly closed his notebook. Blocking the sidewalk ahead of him were 3 older boys. 6th graders. They wore the slightly modified uniforms that indicated they thought of themselves as juvenile delinquents. The kid in the center was towering for his age, built like a brick wall, with skin that looked vaguely metallic and gray. Izuku recognized him. Kenjiro. His quirk was iron skin. He could harden the epidermal layer of his body into an iron-like substance for short periods. He was a known bully who usually picked on the younger kids for their lunch money. He usually avoided Izuku like the plague, strictly out of fear of Katsuki Bakugo. But today, Katsuki wasn't here. Can I help you, Kenjiro-san? Izuku asked politely, his voice calm, polite, and entirely devoid of fear. Kenjiro cracked his knuckles, a metallic clink-clink sound echoing in the quiet street. I heard a rumor today, Midoriya. Someone said that the only reason you act so high and mighty, walking around like you own the place, is because Bakugo fights all your battles. They said you don't even have a quirk. That's not a rumor, Izuku stated matter-of-factly. I am quirkless. It's on my medical file. It's not a secret, Kenjiro sneered. So it's true. You're just a defect. A weakling hiding behind a strong guy. He stepped forward, his skin shimmering as the iron-hardening effect crept up his neck and across his face. Let's see how tough you are without your bodyguard, Deku. Empty your pockets. I want that notebook, too. I bet I could sell it to the weirdos in the upper grades. Izuku sighed. He didn't drop his backpack. He didn't take a fighting stance. He just looked at Kenjiro with an expression of profound disappointment, as if looking at a particularly slow dog that had failed to learn a simple trick. Kenjiro, your quirk is iron skin, correct? Izuku asked, his tone shifting into an analytical, almost professorial cadence. Kenjiro blinked, confused by the lack of fear. Yeah. So what? It means you can't hurt me. It means you harden your epidermis, Izuku corrected, stepping slightly to his left, subtly widening his stance, grounding his feet perfectly on the concrete. But it has a severe physiological drawback. Iron is dense. It doesn't breathe. When you activate your quirk, you completely seal your pores. You cut off your body's ability to perspire and regulate heat. Furthermore, hardening your skin limits the elasticity of your joints. Kenjiro growled, his face fully metallic now. Shut up, nerd. I don't care about your nerd talk. He lunged forward, throwing a heavy, wildly telegraphed right hook aimed straight at Izuku's head. It was a punch that relied entirely on mass and the intimidation factor of an iron fist. To Izuku, moving in the matrix of his own highly trained perception, the punch looked like it was moving in slow motion. Weight shifted entirely to the front foot. No guard on his left side. Center of gravity leaning too far forward. Izuku didn't step back. He stepped in. He ducked flawlessly under the iron fist, feeling the rush of displaced air ruffle his green hair. In a fraction of a second, Izuku's hands shot out. His left hand grabbed the fabric of Kenjiro's uniform sleeve at the elbow. His right hand shot to Kenjiro's lapel, right below the collar. Izuku pivoted sharply on the ball of his foot, turning his back to the larger boy. He dropped his hips, sinking below Kenjiro's center of gravity. He pulled his left arm forward violently while simultaneously lifting his hips. Ippon Sinage. It was physics in its purest form. Kenjiro's own forward momentum, combined with his heavy, iron-dense mass, became his undoing. Izuku essentially became a fulcrum. With a breathless shout, Kenjiro's feet left the ground. He flew up and over Izuku's shoulder, completing a perfect, terrifying arc in the air. Crack! Kenjiro slammed into the solid concrete of the sidewalk flat on his back. Because his skin was hardened into iron, he didn't absorb the shock. The impact rattled through his bones, knocking the wind out of his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. Before Kenjiro could even comprehend what had happened, Izuku was on him. Izuku dropped his weight onto Kenjiro's chest, driving his knee sharply into the boy's solar plexus. At the same time, Izuku maintained his grip on Kenjiro's right arm, pulling it straight up and locking it securely between his own legs, wrapping his hands tightly around Kenjiro's wrist. An armbar. A flawless, textbook Jujigatami. Izuku leaned back just enough to apply pressure to the elbow joint. Not enough to break it, but enough to make the iron-skinned boy yelp in sudden, sharp agony. You're right about one thing, Kenjiro, Izuku said softly, leaning over the older boy. His green eyes were completely devoid of warmth, calculating and cold. I can't punch through your iron skin. It would break my hand. Izuku leaned back a millimeter further. Kenjiro gasped in pain. But your quirk only hardens your skin, Izuku explained, his voice chillingly calm. It doesn't reinforce your ligaments. It doesn't harden your tendons. The joint capsule in your elbow is still perfectly human. And human joints are only meant to bend in one direction. If I apply 15 pounds of pressure in the opposite direction right now, your iron skin won't stop your elbow from snapping backward. The two cronies who had accompanied Kenjiro were frozen in absolute horror. The quirkless kid, the one they thought was just a loudmouthed nerd protected by a monster, had just dismantled their leader in less than 3 seconds. Kenjiro's iron skin began to fade, returning to a pale, terrified flesh color. He was gasping for air, staring up at Izuku as if he were looking at a demon. Let me go, Kenjiro wheezed. Please. Izuku stared at him for a long, quiet moment. He was testing the feeling in his chest. Power. Control. He didn't need explosions. He didn't need super strength. He just needed a brain and the will to use it. Izuku released the tension on the arm and smoothly rolled to his feet, picking up his dropped notebook without breaking eye contact. He dusted off his school uniform trousers. If you ever try to mug a younger student again, Izuku said, adjusting the strap of his backpack, I will systematically break down every biological weakness your quirk possesses, write it in a report, and post it on the public school bulletin board so everyone knows exactly how to neutralize you. Do we understand each other? Kenjiro scrambled backward, nodding frantically. Why yes. We understand. Come on, let's go. He grabbed his cronies, and the three of them sprinted down the street, tripping over their own feet in their haste to get away. Izuku watched them go, letting out a long, slow breath. His hands were shaking slightly. Adrenaline. It was his first real fight outside the dojo. He looked down at his trembling hands, clenching them into tight fists, until the shaking stopped. I did it. I protected myself. TCH. Sloppy form on the throw, Deku. You left your right flank wide open. Izuku whipped his head around. Standing at the corner of the brick wall, leaning casually with his hands shoved deep into his pockets, was Katsuki Bakugo. Katsuki wasn't frowning. He had a wide, feral, immensely satisfied grin plastered across his face. He pushed off the wall and sauntered over, kicking a loose pebble. Kaken, Izuku said, relaxing slightly. How long were you watching? Long enough to see you almost screw up a basic armbar, Katsuki scoffed, though the pride in his eyes was unmistakable. He slung an arm roughly around Izuku's neck, putting him in a loose headlock and ruffling his green hair aggressively. But not bad for a quirkless extra. You used his momentum perfectly. Izuku ducked out of the headlock, smiling brightly. His center of gravity was a mess. It was just basic physics. I told you, Kaken, you have the brawn, but I have the brains, Katsuki scoffed, a tiny spark popping from his thumb. Don't get cocky, nerd. I'm smarter than you too. You got a 92 on the last math test. I got a 98. That was a trick question and you know it. Katsuki roared, his face flushing red as he stomped his foot, a larger explosion detonating in the air. The teacher made a typo on question 14. A real hero anticipates the unexpected, Kaken, Izuku teased, turning on his heel and walking down the street. Katsuki jogged to catch up, grumbling under his breath. They walked in comfortable, competitive banter as the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the pavement. Hey, Deku, Katsuki said suddenly, his voice dropping slightly in pitch, losing a fraction of its usual aggression. Izuku looked over. Yeah? Katsuki stared straight ahead at the setting sun. When we get to UA High, you better not hold me back. We're gonna take over that school. We're gonna show them that I'm the strongest hero in the world. He paused, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. And you're gonna be the smartest tactical hero they've ever seen. We're gonna own that place. Izuku felt a spark of pure, unadulterated excitement ignite in his chest. It wasn't the blind, desperate hope of a child watching a video on a computer screen anymore. It was a calculated, concrete objective. He didn't have a quirk. He didn't have an innate superpower. But he had Katsuki Bakugo pushing him to be faster. He had Sensei Tanaka teaching him to be unbreakable. He had a brain that could dissect the world's most powerful abilities into manageable equations. I won't hold you back, Kaken, Izuku promised, his green eyes reflecting the fiery light of the horizon. I'm going to map out the entire path to the top. All you have to do is follow my lead. Ha! Who's following who, you damn nerd? As their voices echoed down the street, a new kind of hero was being forged. Not one born from divine intervention or genetic lottery, but one constructed from sheer will, unbreakable intellect, and the absolute refusal to be anything less than extraordinary. The boy who analyzed was just getting started. The gymnasium of Aldera Junior High echoed with the sharp squeaks of rubber soles, the booming echoes of teenage shouts, and the occasional, strictly monitored crackle of low-level quirks. It was third-period physical education, and the air was thick with the scent of floor wax and adolescent sweat. For most middle schools, a game of dodgeball was a chaotic free-for-all. At Aldera, where nearly 80% of the student body possessed some form of superhuman ability, dodgeball was a highly tactical, localized war game. The physical education instructor, a weary-looking man named Coach Sato whose quirk allowed him to blow a whistle at deafening, concussive volumes, stood on the sidelines, watching the carnage unfold. On one side of the center line stood Katsuki Bakugo. At 14 years old, Katsuki was already a physical marvel. He was lean, muscular, and radiated an aura of absolute, terrifying dominance. He held a red rubber ball in his right hand, small wisps of smoke curling from his palm, superheating the rubber just enough to make it terrifying without popping it. His team stood behind him, essentially acting as an audience rather than participants. They knew better than to get in his way. On the opposite side of the court stood Izuku Midoriya. If Katsuki was the undeniable king of Aldera's brawn, Izuku was the undisputed architect of its brains. Izuku hadn't hit his major growth spurt yet. He was still relatively compact, but beneath his standard-issue gym uniform, his physique was carved from stone. Years of relentless judo, parkour, and calisthenics had stripped away any baby fat, leaving behind coiled, highly responsive muscle. His dark green hair was tied back with a dark sweatband, his brilliant green eyes scanning the court with the rapid, mechanical precision of a targeting computer. All right, extras! Katsuki roared, his voice carrying over the din of the gymnasium. He pointed the smoking dodgeball directly at Izuku. I'm ending this in one shot. Don't even try to run, Deku! Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't cower. He cracked his neck, shifting his weight onto the balls of his feet. You're telegraphing, Kaken, Izuku called back, his voice smooth, steady, and loud enough to be heard clearly. You always lower your left shoulder when you're about to put an explosion behind a throw. It ruins your aerodynamics. I'll show you aerodynamics, you damn nerd! Katsuki bellowed. Katsuki lunged forward. With a sharp, localized pop from his palm, he launched the rubber ball. It crossed the gymnasium floor at a speed that blurred the red rubber into a solid crimson streak, whistling through the air like an artillery shell. The students on Izuku's team shrieked, scattering like bowling pins. Izuku didn't scatter. He tracked the ball's trajectory. Velocity is approximately 90 km per hour. Angle of release indicates it's aiming for center mass. Rotation is erratic due to the explosive propulsion. Izuku waited until the ball was mere feet away. Then he moved. He didn't just dodge, he executed a flawless pivot. Dropping his center of gravity, he spun on his right heel, letting the superheated ball scream past his chest, close enough to ruffle the fabric of his shirt. As the ball passed, Izuku reached out, matching its velocity with his hand, spinning with the momentum rather than fighting it. He caught the ball, his sneakers skidding backward a few inches from the residual kinetic energy. The gymnasium fell dead silent. Catching one of Bakugo's explosive throws was considered an impossibility at Aldera. Izuku stood up straight, spinning the ball effortlessly on his index finger. He shot Katsuki a sharp, confident smirk. Too much power, not enough spin, Kaken, Izuku analyzed loudly. You sacrificed control for intimidation. Now you're unarmed, and your vanguard is exposed. Izuku snapped his fingers, pointing at two boys on his team. Hiroshi, use your minor telekinesis to curve the next shots. Tsubasa, lay down a covering fire. On my mark, Katsuki ground his teeth, a feral grin breaking across his face. You caught it once, Deku. Let's see you do it again. I don't need to do it again. I just needed to take your ammunition, Izuku replied smoothly. He pulled his arm back, his footwork impeccable, utilizing every ounce of kinetic chaining from his toes to his hips, up through his shoulder. He hurled the ball back, not at Katsuki, but banking it sharply off the hardwood floor. The ball ricocheted at a sharp angle, slamming squarely into the chest of one of Katsuki's lackeys. Tweet! Coach Sato's whistle blasted. Out. The rest of the game was a masterclass in tactical warfare. Izuku didn't just play dodgeball, he played chess. He memorized the cooldowns of the opposing team's quirks. He recognized that the kid who could harden his skin became too heavy to dodge quickly. He noted that the girl who could stretch her arms had a 3-second retraction delay. He orchestrated his team, calling out rapid-fire commands, moving them like pieces on a board, isolating Katsuki from his support. Eventually, it came down to just the two of them. One-on-one. The classic Aldera showdown. Katsuki had 3 balls. Izuku had none. Checkmate, nerd, Katsuki sneered, sparks popping in both hands. You're out of ammo. Ammunition is only useful if you can hit the target, Izuku replied, dropping into a low, coiled crouch. Katsuki unleashed a barrage. He threw the first ball with his right hand, the second with his left, and kicked the third, creating a synchronized 3-point spread designed to cut off all avenues of escape. It was a brilliant, overpowering maneuver. Izuku didn't try to catch them this time. He sprinted straight toward the onslaught. At the last possible second, Izuku threw himself into a forward roll, completely sliding beneath the high shot. He popped up instantly, using the momentum to leap off the flat face of the folded gymnasium bleachers. He executed a horizontal wall run for 3 solid steps, a sheer display of parkour mastery, dodging the second ball. He flipped backward off the bleachers, contorting his body midair to let the third ball pass harmlessly beneath him. He landed in a perfect, 3-point crouch, directly on the center line, staring up at Katsuki. The buzzer blared, signaling the end of the period. A draw. The students erupted into cheers, completely divided between cheering for Bakugo's raw power and Midoriya's untouchable agility. Katsuki stood there, chest heaving slightly. He looked down at Izuku, who was already analyzing his own landing, muttering about rotational drag. Katsuki didn't look angry. He looked fiercely, aggressively proud. You lost a fraction of a second on the wall run, Katsuki critiqued, walking over and roughly offering Izuku a hand. Your right foot slipped. If I had thrown the third ball half a second later, I would have taken your head off. Izuku grabbed Katsuki's hand, letting the explosive teen haul him to his feet. You're right. The floor wax on my left sneaker reduced my traction by about 15%. I should have factored in the environmental variables. Izuku dusted off his pants, smiling. But you still didn't hit me, Kaken. I'll crush you next time, Deku. I look forward to you trying. They walked toward the locker rooms together, the sea of students parting for them. They were the undeniable apex predators of Aldera Junior High. Not because they ruled through fear, though Katsuki certainly inspired his fair share of it, but because they were simply operating on a level so far above everyone else that they were untouchable. They were a closed ecosystem of two. Brains and brawn. The explosive vanguard and the untouchable tactician. Fourth period was homeroom, and the atmosphere in the classroom was significantly duller than the gymnasium. The students sat at their desks, fanning themselves, waiting for the teacher to begin the lesson. Mr. Suzuki, a balding man with a perpetually tired expression, stood at the front of the room holding a thick stack of papers. He dropped them onto his desk with a heavy, unenthusiastic thud. All right, settle down, Suzuki droned, adjusting his glasses. Since you are all third-year students, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures. I'm supposed to pass out these career aptitude forms, but... Suzuki sighed, suddenly grabbing the stack of papers and tossing them over his shoulder, where they scattered across the blackboard like snow. Why bother? I know you all want to go to the hero track. The classroom erupted. Students leaped from their desks, cheering, laughing, and showing off their quirks. Hands turned to rock, fingers stretched, small fires were conjured. It was a cacophony of teenage dreams. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, Suzuki said, waving his hands to calm them down, though his tone was thoroughly bored. But remember, using your quirks during school hours is against the rules. Settle down. Hey, teach! The voice cut through the noise like a serrated blade. The classroom instantly fell silent. Katsuki Bakugo was leaning back in his chair, his feet kicked up disrespectfully onto his desk. He had a cocky, arrogant smirk plastered on his face. Don't lump me in with these background characters. They'd be lucky to end up as sidekicks to some busted D-lister. I'm the real deal. The class erupted in immediate, predictable outrage. Who do you think you're calling background characters, Bakugo? You think you're better than us? I know I'm better than you extras. Katsuki barked back, small explosions popping in his palms, instantly silencing the dissenters. I've aced every mock test. I'm the only one here who has the raw power to make it into UA High School. I'm gonna surpass All Might and become the undisputed #1 hero. Mr. Suzuki looked at his clipboard. Ah, yes. Bakugo. You are indeed applying to UA High. Your grades are flawless, and your quirk assessment is off the charts. It's an ambitious goal, but you certainly have the highest chance among the student body. Katsuki smirked, crossing his arms. He had expected nothing less. Suzuki scanned the paper, his brows suddenly furrowing. He adjusted his glasses, blinking in genuine confusion. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on a boy sitting in the middle row, quietly meticulously organizing his desk. Oh. Midoriya, Suzuki said, his voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and mild amusement. It says here you're also applying for the UA Hero course. The silence that fell over the classroom this time wasn't born of intimidation. It was the silence of pure, unadulterated shock. For a few seconds, nobody breathed. And then, the classroom exploded into laughter. It wasn't the malicious, cruel laughter of bullies. It was the dismissive, condescending laughter of people who thought they had just heard a fantastic joke. Midoriya? The hero course? A boy with elongated fingers snickered. I mean, sure, he's smart, and he's good at gym class, a girl with minor telekinesis added, giggling behind her hand. But he's quirkless. How is he supposed to fight villains? Throw a textbook at them? There's no way Yui would let a normal kid in. It's impossible. Izuku didn't blush. He didn't shrink in his seat. He didn't hide his face behind his arms. He sat perfectly straight, his expression entirely neutral. He waited calmly for the laughter to die down. When it didn't, he took action. Izuku reached into his meticulously organized backpack and pulled out a massive, 3-inch thick black binder. He slammed it down onto his desk. The sheer, heavy thud of the binder hitting the wood was loud enough to startle the students in the immediate vicinity into silence. The silence cascaded until the room was quiet once more. Izuku stood up. He smoothed the front of his uniform, looked directly at his teacher, and spoke in a voice that commanded the room. It is a common misconception that UA High School prohibits quirkless individuals from applying to the hero course, Izuku stated, his voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. He flipped the binder open, revealing hundreds of pages of highlighted documents, legal precedents, and schematics. Prior to the year 2210, there was a mandate in UA's charter that required a quirk manifestation for liability purposes. However, Izuku flipped a page, pointing a sharp finger at a heavily highlighted section of legal text. That rule was abolished under the Equal Opportunity Heroics Act. Currently, there is absolutely zero legal or institutional precedent preventing a quirkless student from taking the entrance exam. Mr. Suzuki blinked, utterly derailed by the sheer volume of legal jargon coming from a 14-year-old. Well, yes, Midoriya, technically the rule was removed. But practically speaking, heroics is not solely defined by genetic mutation, Izuku interrupted, his tone respectful but fiercely unyielding. He turned to face the class, his green eyes scanning the faces of his peers. He wasn't defending himself, he was educating them. Take the underground hero, Eraserhead, Izuku continued, his voice picking up a passionate cadence. His quirk merely erases other quirks. In a physical confrontation against a heteromorphic villain, someone with a physical mutation, Eraserhead is effectively quirkless. He relies entirely on martial arts, capture weaponry, and tactical analysis, or the pro-hero Sir Night Eye. His quirk allows him to see the future, but it has no physical offensive capabilities. He fights with hyperdense support items and predictive movement. Izuku tapped the heavy binder. I have spent the last 10 years studying the physiological weaknesses of every quirk category. I have mastered Kodokan Judo and urban parkour to compensate for my lack of genetic enhancements. I have drafted 14 separate blueprints for non-lethal support gear designed to level the playing field against physical mutations. I am not applying on a whim. I am applying because I possess the tactical intelligence and physical discipline required to be an underground hero. He looked back at the teacher, his gaze intense enough to cut glass. I don't need a quirk to save people. I just need leverage. The class was stunned. The sheer, overwhelming wave of logic, backed by a terrifying amount of research and delivered with the confidence of a seasoned pro-hero, left them entirely speechless. They couldn't mock him. You can't mock someone who has thoroughly, empirically dismantled your argument before you even made it. Katsuki's voice was dangerously low. He hadn't laughed. He had been watching Izuku with a critical, intense stare. Now, he let his feet drop from his desk, standing up slowly. Sparks were practically leaping from his shoulders. If any of you extras think you have the right to laugh at Deku, Katsuki snarled, turning his terrifying crimson glare onto the class, you're stupider than you look. Deku works harder than any of you lazy background characters. He can calculate a villain's weakness in 3 seconds flat. He's applying to UA, because he's the only one here besides me who actually deserves to be there. Katsuki slammed his hand on his desk, detonating a localized explosion that scorched the wood. Deku is my tactician. And we're going to UA, to show all those flashy, overconfident idiots what real power and real brains look like. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with my palms. The terrified class violently shook their heads, suddenly finding the grain of their wooden desks incredibly fascinating. Izuku looked at Katsuki, a warm, genuine smile breaking his severe, analytical expression. Katsuki caught the look, scoffed aggressively, and sat back down, crossing his arms and glaring out the window. Thank you, Kaken, Izuku said softly, before turning back to the teacher. So, Mr. Suzuki? I will require the official UA recommendation forms for the support gear allowance during the practical exam. I expect them by tomorrow. Suzuki, thoroughly defeated by the combined might of Aldera's 2 undisputed kings, simply sighed and rubbed his temples. Yes, Midoriya. I'll print them out. The roof of Aldera Junior High was their sanctuary. It was strictly off-limits to students, a rule that Izuku and Katsuki had ignored since their first year. Izuku knew exactly how to pick the rusted padlock on the stairwell door, a skill he argued was essential for urban infiltration heroics. Lunchtime up here was quiet, save for the hum of the city traffic below, and the occasional gust of wind. They sat on the edge of the roof, their legs dangling over the precipice, eating their bento boxes. Izuku had his massive black binder resting on his lap. He was currently flipping through the blueprint section, a piece of Tamagoyaki hanging from his chopsticks. So, the UE practical exam, Izuku mused, chewing thoughtfully. Historically, it's always been some variation of urban combat or search and rescue. Since they need an objective grading scale for hundreds of applicants, it's highly probable that they use robotic proxies. Villains or targets that can be destroyed or subdued without risking human casualties. Katsuki tore into a piece of spicy fried chicken, his jaw working aggressively. Robots? Easy. I'll just blast them into scrap metal. Melt their circuits. If it's a points game, I'm taking first place. Undoubtedly, Izuku agreed, taking no offense. He knew Katsuki's destructive capabilities better than anyone. Your damage output is perfectly suited for mass destruction. But as a quirkless applicant, my grading metric will likely heavily penalize me if I attempt to fight heavy machinery head-on. I need to be smarter. That's why I'm finalizing my support gear requests. Izuku turned the binder toward Katsuki, tapping a meticulously drawn blueprint. Katsuki leaned over, his eyes narrowing critically. Despite his brutish exterior, Katsuki was incredibly intelligent and possessed a keen eye for mechanics. What is this? Looks like a glorified scarf. It's a variable tension capture weapon, Izuku explained, his eyes lighting up with the familiar thrill of analysis. Inspired heavily by Eraserhead's binding cloth, it's a woven alloy of steel wire and carbon nanofibers. Lightweight, but incredibly durable. I've designed a pair of bracers equipped with compressed CO2 cartridges to fire weighted grappling hooks from the wrists, allowing me to tether the cloth to structures or targets. It's defensive, Katsuki grunted, looking unimpressed. How does a scarf blow up a robot? It doesn't blow them up. It incapacitates them, Izuku countered, flipping to the next page. If the robots run on localized power grids or hydraulics, I don't need to destroy the armor. I just need to sever the mobility joints or cover their optical sensors. The capture tape can snare their limbs, and using my body weight and leverage, I can topple them. Furthermore, Izuku tapped another schematic. This one looked like a pair of sleek, militaristic batons, collapsible eskrima sticks, Izuku continued. Tungsten core for heavy impact, rubberized grip. They're designed to deliver concentrated blunt force trauma to weak points, joints, sensory arrays, cooling vents. I'm also submitting a request for standard issue flashbangs and smoke grenades to obscure visual targeting systems. Katsuki stared at the blueprints for a long time. He reached out, tapping the drawing of the eskrima sticks. The grip is too smooth. If you're using momentum to crack robot joints, the recoil is going to jar your wrists. You'll drop them after the third hit. You need a textured grip with a hilt guard. Izuku blinked, visualizing the physics. He mimed a heavy downward strike with his hands, imagining the shockwave traveling up his forearm. You're entirely right, Kaken. The kinetic feedback on a solid tungsten core would be brutal. A textured grip and a shock-absorbing polymer wrap. Izuku immediately pulled a pen from his pocket and began furiously annotating the blueprint. Good catch. Of course it's a good catch. I'm a genius, Katsuki smirked, leaning back on his hands. You've got 10 months until the exam, Deku. You've got your nerd toys planned out, but what about your body? You're fast, but you still hit like a middle schooler. If you're gonna fight robots, you need to hit harder. I have a plan for that too, Izuku said, closing the binder. He looked out over the sprawling skyline of Muzurifu. You know Dagoba Municipal Beach Park? Katsuki wrinkled his nose in disgust. That massive garbage dump on the coast? Yeah, what about it? It smells like rotting fish and rust. Exactly. The ocean currents have deposited decades of illegal dumping there. Heavy appliances, cars, construction materials, Izuku said, a determined glint in his eye. Starting tomorrow, I'm going to clean it. Katsuki stared at him. You're going to become a janitor? I'm going to engage in extreme, full-body functional strength training, Izuku corrected, a smile playing on his lips. Dragging refrigerators through wet sand, deadlifting engine blocks, tossing tires. It's the perfect, free gymnasium to build raw, functional muscle mass while simultaneously performing a public service. It's hero training in its purest form. Katsuki stared at Izuku for a long moment, before throwing his head back and barking a sharp, genuine laugh. You're insane, Deku. A total psycho. Hauling garbage to get buff. Katsuki wiped a tear from his eye, a vicious grin returning to his face. Fine. But I'm not hauling trash. I'll use the junk piles as target practice. If you're lifting an engine block, I'm gonna blow a hole right through the center of it before you put it down. I expect nothing less, Kaken. But you better not ruin my lifting schedule with your explosions. I'll blow up whatever I want. The 10-month countdown had officially begun. That afternoon, as the final bell rang, Izuku and Katsuki walked out of Aldera Junior High, their minds already focused entirely on the future. The school, the teachers, their classmates, they were all in the rearview mirror now. The only thing that mattered was UA High School. The walk home was a familiar route, weaving through the bustling commercial districts of Muzurifu before transitioning into the quieter, residential neighborhoods. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in vibrant strokes of violet and gold. Izuku was typing rapidly on his smartphone, cross-referencing tide charts for Dagoba Beach to optimize his morning lifting schedule. Katsuki walked beside him, hands shoved deep into his pockets, occasionally kicking a stray soda can with enough force to dent it severely. I still think you need to add a taser function to those batons, Katsuki argued, picking up their earlier conversation without missing a beat. If you're fighting metal, electricity is a no-brainer. Fry their circuits. I considered it, Izuku replied, not looking up from his phone. But high-voltage capacitors add significant weight. It would throw off the balance of the sticks, making them sluggish in close-quarters combat. Plus, if it rains during the exam, I run the risk of electrocuting myself due to the conductivity of the tungsten core. I prefer reliable, kinetic trauma over elemental risks, Katsuki scoffed. Coward. Pain is just a mental block. Spoken like someone whose quirk literally makes them immune to their own explosive concussions, Izuku fired back mildly. They turned a corner, leaving the bright afternoon sun and entering the shadowed, concrete tunnel of a pedestrian underpass. It was a shortcut that shaved about 10 minutes off their walk home. Usually, it was empty. Today, the air inside the tunnel felt wrong. It didn't smell like the usual damp concrete and exhaust fumes. The air was thick, cloying, and carried the rancid, gag-inducing stench of raw sewage and rotting eggs. Izuku stopped walking immediately. His phone slipped smoothly into his pocket. His posture shifted, the relaxed slump of a student instantly vanishing, replaced by the coiled, hyper-alert stance of a martial artist. His eyes darted around the dim underpass, analyzing the shadows, listening to the echoing drip of water. The smell is localized. Not a general sewer leak. It's concentrated, moving. Katsuki stopped a step ahead of him, his nose wrinkling in disgust. What the hell is that stench? Did a sewage pipe burst? Kaken. Behind you. Izuku's voice was completely devoid of panic. It was a flat, clinical warning. From the heavy iron grate of a storm drain directly behind Katsuki, a viscous, dark green sludge began to ooze upward. It didn't pool on the ground. It defied gravity, rising and coalescing into a towering, gelatinous mass. Within the horrifying, shifting Mach 2 bulbous, bloodshot eyes opened, followed by a wide, jagged mouth filled with broken teeth. It was a villain. A heteromorphic, fluid body type. Well, the sludge villain gurgled, its voice sounding like thick mud bubbling over a fire. What do we have here? A perfect, medium-sized meat shield. And he smells like he's got a powerful quirk, too. The villain lunged. It was fast. Shockingly fast for something made entirely of liquid. A massive, muddy tendril shot forward, aiming directly for Katsuki. In a normal timeline, this would be the moment of panic. The moment where a young boy is caught off guard, overwhelmed by the sheer horror of a monster, and subdued before he could fight back. But this wasn't a normal timeline. And Katsuki Bakugo was not a normal boy. And he certainly wasn't alone. Katsuki didn't freeze. His instincts, honed by years of relentless sparring with Izuku, kicked in instantly. He spun around, his hands already raised, sweat igniting in his palms. Get the hell away from me, you walking toilet! Katsuki roared, unleashing a point-blank explosion directly into the approaching tendril. Boom! The concussive blast echoed deafeningly in the enclosed space of the underpass. The fiery shockwave blew the sludge tendril apart, scattering green muck across the concrete walls. But the victory was instantaneous and entirely hollow. Because the villain was fluid, the explosion didn't damage him. It merely displaced him. The sludge reformed almost immediately, the villain laughing a wet, terrifying laugh. Nice quirk, kid. A bit flashy. But it'll do nicely once I take over your nervous system. The villain surged forward, a tidal wave of suffocating sludge, far too massive to be blown away by a single explosion. It wrapped around Katsuki's legs, climbing rapidly up his torso, seeking to force its way into his mouth and nose. Katsuki struggled violently, letting off continuous explosions, but it was like trying to blow up an ocean. The sludge absorbed the impact, suffocating the flames. Get off me! Katsuki gagged, his red eyes widening as the sludge began to cover his mouth. A normal bystander would have run. A normal middle schooler would have screamed for a pro-hero. Izuku Midoriya did neither. He didn't possess an ounce of hesitation. He had spent his entire life preparing for the moment violence entered his world. He didn't have trauma paralyzing his limbs. He had years of drilled, cold, tactical analysis demanding action. Enemy is fluid. Blunt force is useless. Explosions are being absorbed and smothered. Objective: free the captive's airway and disrupt the enemy's physical core. Izuku's eyes locked onto the villain. The fluid was practically invulnerable, but the eyes were solid. They were the only biological anchors the creature possessed. Izuku moved. He didn't shout a battle cry. He didn't warn the villain. He simply exploded into motion. Izuku sprinted at the wall of the underpass, using his parkour momentum to run horizontally along the curved concrete, completely bypassing the massive pool of sludge pooling around Katsuki's feet. He launched himself off the wall, flying through the air directly toward the towering face of the villain. Mid-air, Izuku reached into his breast pocket. He didn't have his eskrima sticks. He didn't have his capture tape. He had a solid brass, thick-barreled fountain pen. Izuku gripped the pen like a tactical knife. As gravity began to pull him down, he aimed with terrifying, mechanical precision. With all the kinetic force of his leap behind it, Izuku drove the brass pen deeply, viciously, directly into the sludge villain's massive right eye. The villain let out an agonizing, ear-piercing shriek of pure agony. Gah! My eye! You little rat! The shock of the pain caused the villain's concentration to shatter. The fluid holding Katsuki slackened for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening Izuku needed. Landing squarely on the villain's fluid mass, which was now trembling in pain, Izuku reached out, grabbed the collar of Katsuki's uniform with both hands, planted his feet firmly against the villain's gelatinous chest, and executed a brutal, backward judo sacrifice throw, Tomo Nage. Using his entire body weight and leg strength, Izuku ripped Katsuki free from the suffocating sludge, launching them both backward. They hit the concrete hard, rolling away from the monster. Izuku was on his feet instantly, pulling a coughing, hacking Katsuki up with him. Airway clear, Kaken? Izuku demanded, his eyes never leaving the thrashing villain. Katsuki coughed up a wad of green slime, his eyes burning with absolute, murderous rage. Yeah. I'm gonna kill this bastard. Negative, Izuku commanded, his voice slicing through Katsuki's rage like ice. We lack the area of effect capability to destroy a fluid mass of this size. We've injured its optical sensor, buying us time. We are falling back to the street level to restrict its mobility, and wait for. Izuku's tactical assessment was cut short by a sound. It was a sound that Izuku had listened to 1,000 times on his computer. A heavy, rhythmic booming sound, like a massive engine roaring to life, echoing down the tunnel. The heavy thud of impossibly dense footsteps. A shadow fell over the entrance of the underpass. Have no fear, boys. A voice boomed, deep, resonant, and overflowing with absolute, unshakable confidence. Izuku's breath hitched. His tactical mind shut down for exactly 1 second. Stepping into the dim light of the underpass, ducking slightly to fit his massive, muscular frame under the concrete archway, was a mountain of a man wearing a plain white t-shirt and cargo pants. He carried 2 plastic grocery bags in one hand. His blonde hair was styled into 2 prominent tufts that resembled a V. His smile was brighter than the sun. I am here, All Might declared, dropping the grocery bags and pulling back a fist the size of a boulder. The sludge villain froze, his one good eye widening in absolute, primal terror. All Might? No. Wait, Texas. Smash. All Might threw the punch. He didn't hit the villain. He didn't need to. The sheer, unfathomable kinetic force of the punch compressed the air in the underpass, creating a localized tornado. The wind pressure was so intense it felt like a solid wall hitting them. Izuku and Katsuki were thrown off their feet, sliding backward on the concrete as the hurricane-force winds ripped the fluid villain apart on a molecular level, scattering him into thousands of harmless, quivering droplets across the tunnel walls. The wind died down as quickly as it had begun. The tunnel was silent, save for the gentle fluttering of plastic grocery bags. Izuku slowly sat up, his green eyes wide, staring at the literal god of his world standing mere feet away. All Might stood tall, wiping a speck of dirt from his shoulder, still smiling brightly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a large, empty, plastic 2-liter soda bottle. In a blur of motion, he began scooping up the scattered remnants of the villain, trapping them securely inside the plastic prison. A flawless tactical intervention, young man. All Might suddenly boomed, turning to look directly at Izuku. The number 1 hero's blue eyes sparkled with genuine respect. You didn't hesitate. You analyzed the villain's physical composition, identified the only solid weak point, struck with absolute precision, and extracted the hostage in seconds. Marvelous instinct. Izuku's heart was hammering against his ribs. He slowly pushed himself to his feet. Katsuki was beside him, looking unusually stunned, though he quickly scowled and crossed his arms to hide it. You saw that? Izuku breathed. Indeed I did. All Might laughed, capping the soda bottle tightly. I was pursuing this slippery fellow through the sewers, but he gave me the slip. I arrived just in time to see you strike. Tell me, young man, what is your quirk? It must be some sort of hyper-analysis or combat processing. Izuku froze. The question. The eternal question. Usually, this was the moment where people looked at him with pity. This was the moment where the world reminded him of his place. But Izuku Midoriya was not the boy he used to be. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his gaze locking directly onto the symbol of peace. He didn't look down. He didn't stutter. I don't have one, sir, Izuku said, his voice clear, calm, and immensely proud. I am quirkless. I rely entirely on martial arts, physics, and tactical analysis. All Might blinked. The heroic smile faltered for a fraction of a second, entirely caught off guard. Quirkless? But the speed, the precision, you engaged a villain without a quirk? Yes, sir, Izuku replied evenly. Because a hero doesn't need a quirk to save someone. They just need leverage. All Might stared at the green-haired boy. The winds of destiny, which had been stagnant for years, suddenly began to howl. All Might looked at the fire in Izuku's eyes, the absolute, unbroken confidence, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Young man, All Might said, his voice losing some of its booming theatrics, settling into a tone of intense, serious curiosity. What is your name? Izuku Midoriya, sir. And I am going to be the first quirkless hero. And in the shadowy confines of a municipal underpass, the gears of the universe finally locked into place. The damp, subterranean chill of the pedestrian underpass was entirely swept away, replaced by the residual heat of All Might's devastating Texas smash. The wind slowly died down, leaving a profound, ringing silence in its wake. Izuku Midoriya, sir. And I am going to be the first quirkless hero. The words hung in the air, bold and unshakable. Izuku stood tall, his green eyes locked onto the towering symbol of peace. Beside him, Katsuki Bakugo was violently wiping a stray fleck of green sludge from his cheek, but he didn't utter a word of protest or mockery at Izuku's declaration. He merely scowled, his crimson eyes flicking between his childhood rival and the number 1 hero. All Might stood frozen for a fraction of a second. His brilliant blue eyes, usually alight with an impenetrable, media-trained confidence, softened with genuine surprise. He looked at the boy's hands, unscarred, unmutated, perfectly human, and then looked at the fierce, analytical fire burning in his gaze. Quirkless? All Might thought, his mind racing. But the tactical precision, the utter lack of hesitation. I saw the way he moved. He didn't just throw himself blindly into danger. He calculated the trajectory, identified the biological weak point, and executed a flawless extraction. He fought like a seasoned underground pro. Quirkless, All Might repeated aloud, the booming theatricality dropping from his voice, replaced by a low, rumbling baritone of genuine intrigue. I must admit, young Midoriya, you are full of surprises. To engage a fluid-type villain with nothing but martial arts and a fountain pen, it borders on madness. But it was undeniably effective. Izuku didn't blush under the praise. He merely nodded, his analytical mind already breaking down the encounter. Fluid-type heteromorphic bodies possess a significant advantage against kinetic and explosive assaults, Izuku explained, his voice slipping into a rapid, professorial cadence. Kakin's explosions were highly destructive, but applying concussive force to a non-Newtonian fluid simply disperses the mass temporarily. It doesn't neutralize the threat. By identifying the villain's optical sensors, the only solid biological anchor necessary for visual processing, I was able to disrupt its central nervous system long enough to initiate a rescue. Katsuki ground his teeth, sparks popping aggressively in his left palm. I had him right where I wanted him, you damn nerd. I was just about to evaporate his core. Your oxygen supply was completely compromised, Kakin, Izuku countered smoothly, not even turning his head. In approximately 45 seconds you would have suffered from hypoxia, leading to irreversible brain damage or cardiac arrest. Evaporation requires sustained thermal energy, which you couldn't generate without inhaling oxygen to fuel your own cardiovascular system. Katsuki opened his mouth to scream, his face flushing crimson with indignant rage, but he snapped his jaw shut. He knew Izuku was right. He hated it, but he knew it. He settled for kicking a pebble with enough force to shatter it against the concrete wall. All Might watched this exchange, absolutely fascinated. The dynamic between the two boys was incredibly unique. The explosive one was a powerhouse of raw talent and volatile pride, while the quirkless one was a chillingly calm, tactical supercomputer who clearly held the reins of their partnership. Suddenly, a sharp, stabbing pain erupted in All Might's side. Cough! A small spray of blood escaped All Might's lips, splattering against the back of his massive hand. He quickly turned his head, hiding the grimace of agony that twisted his features. His time limit, the 3 hours of daily heroism he was allotted, were rapidly burning away. The exertion of the Texas smash had accelerated the clock. Well? All Might suddenly boomed, his voice echoing loudly as he forced the smile back onto his face. He patted his cargo pants pocket, ensuring the 2-liter soda bottle containing the sludge villain was secure. I must be off. I need to deliver this slippery fellow to the authorities. You two boys have incredibly bright futures ahead of you. Stay safe, and remember. Wait. Izuku took a step forward, his hand raised. He had 100 questions. 1,000. About structural engineering, about All Might's kinetic chaining, about the socio-economic impact of localized weather manipulation. No time for autographs, my boy. A hero's work is never done. With a mighty bend of his knees, the concrete beneath All Might's boots cracked. He launched himself into the air like a localized missile, shooting out of the underpass archway and disappearing into the golden sky, leaving a trail of displaced air in his wake. Izuku watched him go, a small sigh escaping his lips. I really wanted to ask him about the shock absorption properties of his boots, he muttered, pulling his ruined, slightly bent brass pen from his pocket, and looking at it mournfully. Whatever, Katsuki grunted, shoving his hands deep into his pockets, and stomping toward the exit of the underpass. Let's go, Deku. You smell like a sewer. We both do, Izuku pointed out, jogging slightly to catch up. High above them, traversing the city skyline in massive, kilometer-long leaps, All Might gritted his teeth against the searing pain in his abdomen. His scar was burning, a phantom fire reminding him of his impending mortality. As he prepared to land on a nearby roof to initiate his descent, a sharp spasm racked his side. He flinched midair. As he clutched his stomach, his hand brushed against the pocket of his cargo pants. The fabric, worn thin from years of use, snagged. The heavy, pressurized 2-liter soda bottle slipped from the shallow pocket, tumbling silently down into the maze of the city streets below. All Might, blinded by the pain and the rushing wind, didn't notice a thing. 15 minutes later, Izuku and Katsuki were walking through the Tatooine shopping district. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. The streets were crowded with commuters, shoppers, and students heading home. The atmosphere between the two boys was tense. Katsuki was seething in a quiet, simmering rage. Being caught by the villain was a massive blow to his monumental ego. Being saved by Izuku, even if he conceptually accepted Izuku as his tactical partner, was an entirely different pill to swallow. I could have burned my way out, Katsuki muttered abruptly, his eyes glaring at the pavement. Your sweat glands require specific biological conditions to produce nitroglycerin, Izuku replied calmly, casually adjusting the strap of his backpack. Under extreme stress and lack of oxygen, your body's sympathetic nervous system prioritizes vital organs. Your sweat production would have plummeted. It was a terrible matchup for you, Kaken. There's no shame in a tactical retreat. I don't retreat, Katsuki snapped, whipping around to grab Izuku by the collar of his uniform. And I don't need you patronizing me, Deku. I'm gonna be the number one. Boom! The explosion was deafening. It wasn't one of Katsuki's localized blasts. It was a massive, concussive shockwave that rattled the windows of the storefronts and sent a flock of pigeons scattering into the sky. A thick plume of black smoke instantly began to rise from an alleyway just 2 blocks down the street. Screams erupted from the crowd. Pedestrians began to panic, shoving past each other to run in the opposite direction of the blast. Katsuki let go of Izuku's collar, his crimson eyes widening. What the hell was that? Izuku didn't answer. His mind shifted gears instantly. The relaxed posture of a student vanished, replaced by the coiled, hyper-focused stance of a first responder. He calculated the distance, the wind direction, and the volume of the smoke. Structural fire. Possible villain attack. Distance, 200 meters, Izuku muttered, his legs already moving. Hey! Wait up, you damn nerd! Katsuki yelled, breaking into a sprint to follow him. They pushed through the fleeing crowd, Izuku using his agile, parkour-trained footwork to slip between panicked adults like water flowing through rocks. Katsuki took a less subtle approach, simply shoving people out of his way with aggressive barks. When they rounded the corner into the main square of the shopping district, they were met with a scene of absolute chaos. A massive fire had broken out in the narrow alleyway between a multi-story office building and a strip mall. Flames licked the brick walls, superheating the air and sending thick, toxic black smoke billowing into the sky. And in the center of the inferno, laughing maniacally, was the sludge villain. He escaped? Katsuki shouted over the roar of the flames, his fists clenching. How the hell did he get out of the bottle? Izuku's eyes darted rapidly, analyzing the battlefield. The villain had grown larger, feeding off the panic and the ambient moisture. He was thrashing wildly, tearing down street signs and smashing windows. But that wasn't the worst part. Wrapped tightly within the viscous, suffocating mass of green sludge was a teenage boy. He had spiky silver hair and was thrashing violently, his eyes rolling back in his head as the villain forced itself into his mouth and nose. Hostage situation, Izuku's mind supplied instantly. The villain requires a meat shield to avoid capture. He must have ambushed someone the moment he broke free. A perimeter had been established, sort of. Several pro-heroes were on the scene, but they were doing absolutely nothing to stop the attack. Death Arms, a hero with superhuman strength, was holding back the crowd. It's no good, he yelled, sweating profusely. I can't get close enough to grab him, and my punches just pass right through his liquid body. Kamui Woods, the rising star hero who could manipulate wood from his body, was standing helplessly on the sidelines. My quirk is made of wood. If I try to bind him in this heat, I'll catch fire immediately. Empty Lady, the giantification hero, was standing at the entrance of the alley, her hands on her hips in frustration. I need at least a 2-lane road to operate. I can't fit down there without crushing the surrounding buildings. Izuku stared at the pro-heroes, his brow furrowing in profound, clinical disbelief. They are standing still, Izuku thought, his mind racing. They have assessed their individual quirk incompatibilities and have entirely defaulted to the bystander effect. They are waiting for someone with a better quirk to arrive. They are allowing a civilian to suffocate because they refuse to think outside the rigid parameters of their genetic mutations. Izuku felt a cold, sharp spike of anger pierce his usually calm demeanor. This was exactly what he had written about in his notebooks. Quirks made people lazy. When a hero's only tool was a hammer, every problem had to be a nail. If it wasn't a nail, they gave up. Kaken, Izuku said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding register. I'm gonna blast that sludge freak into orbit. Katsuki snarled, stepping forward. No. Izuku grabbed Katsuki's arm, his grip surprisingly strong. Look at the environment. The alley is enclosed. The fire is already at a Class A combustion level, feeding on the building materials. If you go in there and use an explosion, the concussive force will shatter the remaining structural supports of that office building. Furthermore, the oxygen depletion from your blast will instantly suffocate the hostage. Your quirk is tactically unviable here. Katsuki whipped his head around, glaring at Izuku. Then what the hell are we supposed to do? Just watch him die like these useless pros. I am going to extract the hostage, Izuku said calmly. He dropped his heavy yellow backpack onto the pavement. He unzipped it rapidly, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. You're quirkless! Death Arms shouted, noticing the two boys near the police tape. Get back, kids! It's too dangerous. Izuku ignored the hero entirely. He pulled two items from his backpack. The first was a thick, heavy-duty thermos made of insulated steel. The second was a highly pressurized, compact can of aerosol freezing spray, the kind athletes use to instantly numb sprains and injuries. It was a standard piece of support gear Izuku always carried for his rigorous parkour sessions. Izuku strapped the aerosol can to his belt. He gripped the steel thermos in his right hand. Kaken, Izuku said, never taking his eyes off the villain. I need you to create a localized thermal updraft. Not an explosion. Just heat. Point your palms at the ground at the entrance of the alley and release continuous, low-level sparks. Create a wall of heat to manipulate the air pressure. It will draw the smoke upward and clear my visual field. Katsuki grinned, a wild, dangerous expression. He didn't question the order. You got it, Commander Nerd. Don't die. Izuku ducked under the yellow police tape. Hey! Stop! Death Arms roared, lunging to grab the boy. Izuku didn't even look at the pro-hero. As Death Arms reached for him, Izuku flawlessly executed a duck and pivot, letting the massive hero's arms sail over his head. Izuku used his momentum to transition into a dead sprint, heading straight into the inferno. Kid, are you crazy? Kamui Woods yelled. Izuku blocked out the noise. His vision tunneled, the world breaking down into cold, hard geometry. The heat of the fire lashed at his skin, singeing the edges of his school uniform, but he pushed the pain aside. Pain was just neurological feedback. It could be ignored. Behind him, Katsuki crouched low, aiming his palms at the asphalt. Crackle hiss. A massive, sustained wave of thermal energy erupted from Katsuki's hands, superheating the ambient air. Just as Izuku calculated, the sudden influx of heat created an artificial updraft. The thick, blinding black smoke was violently sucked upward, clearing the alleyway just enough for Izuku to see. The sludge villain spotted him. You again? The villain roared, its massive eye widening in recognition. I'll drown you this time, you little pest. A massive tendril of sludge whipped forward, aiming to crush Izuku against the brick wall. Izuku didn't slow down. Trajectory is linear. Speed is high, but the mass makes it sluggish to course correct. Izuku leaped, not away from the tendril, but toward the wall. His rubber-soled sneakers hit the vertical brick face. He engaged a horizontal wall run, taking 3 rapid, gravity-defying steps along the side of the building, completely bypassing the sweeping sludge attack beneath him. At the peak of his wall run, Izuku pushed off violently. He soared through the superheated air, directly toward the villain's main body. The hostage, the silver-haired boy, locked eyes with Izuku. The boy's eyes were filled with absolute terror and despair. I am here, Izuku thought, his face a mask of unbreakable resolve. Mid-air, Izuku brought his right arm back. He held the heavy, insulated steel thermos like a club. He didn't aim for the villain's eye this time. The villain was guarding it with a thick layer of sludge. He aimed for the mass of fluid directly covering the hostage's face. With all the kinetic force of his leap, augmented by years of upper body conditioning, Izuku smashed the steel thermos directly into the sludge. It wasn't a biological attack. It was a physics attack. The blunt force trauma displaced the fluid just enough to expose the hostage's nose and mouth. The silver-haired boy gasped violently, sucking in a desperate lungful of air. You little brat! The villain shrieked, the sludge churning violently as it attempted to swallow Izuku whole. Izuku didn't fall. He grabbed the fabric of the hostage's shirt with his left hand, using the boy as an anchor to keep himself suspended against the gelatinous monster. With his right hand, Izuku dropped the thermos. It clattered to the asphalt below. In a flash, he drew the pressurized can of athletic freezing spray from his belt. Non-Newtonian fluids react violently to rapid temperature shifts. Freezing the molecular structure will nullify its elasticity. Izuku jammed the nozzle of the freezing spray directly into the thickest part of the sludge, restraining the hostage's torso, and pressed the trigger. Hiatus. A concentrated blast of sub-zero chemical coolant erupted into the sludge. The reaction was instantaneous. The dark green liquid, supercooled in a fraction of a second, crystallized and froze solid, turning a sickly, pale shade of white. The sudden change in density caused the sludge to contract and brittle. The villain screamed, an unearthly sound of agony as a massive chunk of its body was paralyzed. Now! Izuku roared. He planted his feet against the newly frozen, solid chunk of sludge. He gripped the hostage's collar with both hands and pushed off with the explosive leg strength of a trained tracer. Crack! The frozen sludge shattered like cheap glass. Izuku ripped the hostage entirely free from the villain's grasp, the two boys flying backward through the air. Izuku twisted his body, taking the brunt of the impact as they hit the ground, rolling across the asphalt to safely disperse the kinetic energy. Izuku popped up instantly, dragging the coughing, sputtering hostage to his feet. The crowd was completely silent. The pro-heroes were frozen in absolute shock. A 14-year-old boy, without using a single quirk, had just systematically dismantled a villain they had deemed untouchable, executing a flawless extraction in less than 15 seconds. My body! The sludge villain wailed, thrashing wildly as it tried to compensate for the frozen, shattered chunk of its mass. I'll kill you! I'll kill all of you! The villain gathered its remaining mass, rearing back to deliver a massive, crushing wave of sludge that would drown the entire alleyway. Izuku stood in front of the rescued civilian, raising his arms in a defensive guard, his mind rapidly calculating survival odds. If I take the brunt of the impact, I can shield the hostage's vital organs. But the impact never came. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over the alleyway. The air pressure dropped violently, the roaring flames of the fire flickering and dying as if snuffed out by an invisible, suffocating weight. Izuku looked up. Standing at the entrance of the alley, his massive frame silhouetted against the setting sun, was All Might. The hero wasn't smiling his usual, meteorite grin. His face was set in a mask of absolute, terrifying fury. I am pathetic, All Might thought, blood dripping from his mouth, entirely ignored. I stood in the crowd. I watched. I told myself my time was up. I told myself I couldn't do anything. And then, this quirkless boy. This boy with nothing but his mind and his courage threw himself into the fire. He taught me a lesson I had forgotten. Pros are always risking their lives. All Might roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the surrounding buildings. He pulled back his right arm. The muscles bulged, tearing the fabric of his white t-shirt. The sheer kinetic energy gathering in his fist was visible, warping the air around it. Detroit. The sludge villain froze, genuine panic setting in. No! Wait! Smash! All Might threw the punch straight down the alley. He didn't hit the villain. He punched the air itself. The concussive shockwave was apocalyptic. It ripped through the alley like a localized hurricane. The remaining fires were extinguished instantly, blown away by the sheer pressure. The sludge villain was atomized, blown into microscopic droplets that splattered harmlessly against the brick walls. But the force of the punch didn't stop there. The updraft created by the Detroit smash punched a hole straight through the atmosphere. The clouds above Muzutafa's city, previously calm and scattered, violently converged. Within seconds, heavy, cold rain began to fall. All Might had changed the weather with a single punch. Izuku stood in the pouring rain, his school uniform soaked, his breath coming in heavy pants. He stared at All Might, entirely awestruck by the sheer, unfathomable scale of the hero's power. It was one thing to analyze it on a screen. It was another to feel the shockwave rattle your internal organs. All Might slowly stood up straight, the steam rising off his heated skin. He looked down the alley, his eyes locking onto Izuku. The hero didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look of profound respect in his eyes spoke volumes. The silence was broken by the sudden, frantic rush of the pro-heroes and the police. Secure the perimeter. Get the paramedics in here for the civilian. Izuku allowed the paramedics to take the silver-haired boy. He picked up his thermos and his backpack, shaking the water from his green hair. He turned to walk back toward the street, where Katsuki was waiting, his arms crossed and a smug smirk on his face. Midoriya! Izuku stopped. Death Arms and Kamui Woods were marching toward him, their expressions stern and furious. What were you thinking, kid? Death Arms bellowed, pointing a thick finger at Izuku's chest. That was the most reckless, suicidal stunt I've ever seen. You're quirkless. You have no training, no license, and no business interfering with a villain attack. You could have been killed. You got lucky, kid, Kamui Woods added, crossing his arms. Leave the hero work to the professionals. Izuku slowly turned to face the two towering heroes. He didn't look intimidated. He didn't look apologetic. He looked at them with the cold, clinical assessment of a surgeon examining a botched operation. Professionals? Izuku echoed, his voice low, steady, and cutting through the rain like a scalpel. The tone of his voice caught the heroes off guard. They expected a crying, traumatized child, or a cocky delinquent. They didn't expect the icy authority of a seasoned tactician. Let us review the facts of the incident, Izuku said, taking a step forward. He was half their size, but somehow, he suddenly felt like the tallest person in the alley. Fact 1. A civilian was actively suffocating, with a projected expiration window of less than 2 minutes, Izuku stated, ticking off a finger. Fact 2. The 4 pro-heroes on the scene possessed quirks that were either structurally or environmentally incompatible with a rescue operation in this specific terrain. Fact 3. Rather than coordinate a localized extraction using fundamental physics, such as utilizing the nearby fire hydrants to dilute the villain's fluid mass, or using Kamui Wood's timber to create a structural wedge to free the hostage's airway, you chose to stand on the perimeter and wait for a better quirk to arrive. Death Arm's face flushed a deep, angry red. Listen here, you little brat, I am not finished, Izuku interrupted, his voice raising a decibel, sharp and authoritative. Under the Good Samaritan Clause of the National Heroics Act, Article 4, Section B, a civilian is legally permitted to intervene in a crisis if, and only if, licensed heroes are entirely incapacitated or willfully failing to prevent imminent loss of life. Izuku stared directly into Death Arm's eyes. You were willfully failing. I assessed the environmental variables, formulated a non-lethal extraction utilizing legally approved support items, coordinated a smoke-clearing maneuver with a civilian bystander, and successfully removed the hostage without engaging the villain in unauthorized combat. I did not break the law. I saved a life while you were busy preserving your agency's liability insurance. Dead silence fell over the heroes. Kamui Woods actually took a half-step back, his wooden face unreadable, though his posture screamed discomfort. Death Arms opened his mouth, closed it, and ground his teeth. They had just been completely, thoroughly, and legally dismantled by a middle schooler. He's right, you know. Everyone turned. Katsuki Bakugo swaggered over, hands in his pockets, rain slicking down his ash-blonde hair. He looked at the pros with absolute, undisguised contempt. Deku did your jobs for you, Katsuki sneered. If it wasn't for him, that extra would be dead. So instead of yelling at my tactician, maybe you should figure out why a quirkless nerd is better at saving people than you are. Katsuki grabbed Izuku's shoulder, forcefully turning him around. Come on, Deku. We're wasting our time with these delisters. We've got training to do. Izuku didn't argue. He allowed Katsuki to lead him away, walking past the stunned pro-heroes, past the flashing lights of the police cruisers, and out into the rainy streets of Mizurifu. As they walked, Katsuki glanced sideways at Izuku. You froze the sludge. That was smart. It was basic chemistry, Kaken, Izuku replied, adjusting his backpack. Though I admit, it was a gamble. If the villain's core temperature was higher, the aerosol might have evaporated before causing a state change. TCH, nerd. Katsuki smirked. Next time, just tell me to blow him up. I'll figure out the oxygen thing. They walked in comfortable silence for a few blocks. The adrenaline was slowly fading from Izuku's system, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in his muscles. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, washing the smell of smoke and sewage from their clothes. I am here! Izuku and Katsuki both jumped. From a side street, moving with a blur of speed that defied physics, All Might suddenly appeared, skidding to a halt in front of them. He was panting slightly, the rain running down his muscular physique. All Might? Izuku gasped, his analytical mask dropping instantly, replaced by pure fanboy awe. How did you get away from the press? Ha ha! I stand for justice, not sound bites. All Might laughed loudly, striking a pose. But almost immediately, the laugh turned into a wet, agonizing cough. Before the boy's eyes, a thick cloud of white steam suddenly erupted from the number one hero. The massive, muscular form of the symbol of peace completely vanished. When the steam cleared, Izuku and Katsuki froze. Standing in All Might's place was a skeletal, emaciated man with sunken, shadowed eyes, sharp angular features, and clothes that hung off his fragile frame like a scarecrow. He looked sickly, frail, and entirely mortal. What the hell? Katsuki took a step back, his red eyes wide with shock. Is this some kind of imposter? Izuku didn't step back. His mind rapidly processed the visual data. Same hair color. Same facial structure, albeit devoid of subcutaneous fat. Same vocal cords, adjusted for lung capacity. Conclusion: this is All Might. A physical regression caused by extreme trauma or biological depletion. It's really him, Kaken, Izuku said softly, his eyes filled with profound understanding. He looked at the skeletal man. You're injured. Severely. The time limit you mentioned in the underpass. It's a restriction on how long you can maintain your muscular form, isn't it? The skeletal All Might sighed, a sound like dry leaves scraping across pavement. He sat down heavily on a nearby bus stop bench, wiping a trickle of blood from his chin. You truly are terrifyingly perceptive, young Midoriya. Yes. 5 years ago, I suffered a catastrophic injury in a fight with a certain villain. My respiratory system was practically destroyed, and my stomach was entirely removed. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. The rest of the time, I look like this. Katsuki stared in horror. The invincible idol he had worshipped his entire life, the man he swore to surpass, was sitting on a bus bench looking like a strong breeze could kill him. 5 years ago. Was it the toxic chainsaw fight? Katsuki asked, his voice unusually quiet. No, All Might replied softly. That punk couldn't scratch me. This was a fight kept hidden from the public. A symbol of peace cannot be seen bleeding. The public needs to believe I am invincible. All Might looked up, his sunken blue eyes locking directly onto Izuku. The hero's gaze was piercing, stripping away the rain and the gloom, seeing straight into the boy's core. I came here to thank you, young Midoriya, All Might said seriously. And to apologize. Earlier today, in the underpass, you told me you were going to be the first quirkless hero. If I had stayed a moment longer, I would have told you no. Izuku's breath hitched. He stood perfectly still. I would have told you that hero work is too dangerous without a quirk, All Might continued, his voice heavy with regret. I would have told you to become a police officer or a doctor. I would have crushed your dream, based entirely on my own narrow view of what a hero must be. All Might stood up, walking slowly toward Izuku. But then, I stood in the crowd at that alleyway. I, the number one hero, with a quirk granted to me by destiny, stood by and did nothing because I was afraid of my own limits. But you, a quirkless boy with nothing but a backpack and a brilliant mind, you moved. You didn't hesitate. You acted when everyone else was paralyzed. All Might placed a large, bony hand on Izuku's shoulder. You told me that a hero doesn't need a quirk to save people. They just need leverage, All Might said, quoting Izuku's own words back to him. You were right, young man. You are already a hero. Izuku felt a lump form in his throat. He had built his entire life around absolute, unshakable confidence. He had trained his body to be a weapon, his mind to be a supercomputer. He had never needed validation from anyone, not even Katsuki. But hearing those words from All Might, it broke through his clinical armor. A single tear slipped down Izuku's cheek, mixing with the rain. However, All Might said, his tone suddenly shifting, dropping the melancholy and replacing it with a burning, intense gravity. While a brilliant mind and a brave heart are the foundation of a hero, there are evils in this world that cannot be defeated by leverage alone. There are monsters of pure, terrifying power. All Might squeezed Izuku's shoulder. I have been searching for a long time, young Midoriya. Searching for a successor. Someone worthy of inheriting my power. Katsuki's head snapped up, his eyes wide. Inherit your power? My quirk is a highly guarded secret, All Might explained, stepping back and looking between the two boys. It is not a natural mutation. It is a sacred torch, passed down from generation to generation. A power that stockpiles the kinetic energy and strength of its wielders, growing stronger with each passing. It is called One for All. Izuku's analytical mind short-circuited. A transferable quirk? That defies every known biological law of genetic mutation. The cellular adaptation required to harbor foreign DNA. I was born quirkless, too, All Might revealed, dropping the final, world-shattering bombshell. Izuku gasped. The man you see before you, the symbol of peace, was once just a quirkless boy who wanted to save the world. All Might smiled, a soft, nostalgic expression. My master saw the same fire in me that I see in you today. Izuku Midoriya, your tactical intellect is unparalleled. Your spirit is unbreakable. But your body has reached the limits of human biology. All Might held out his hand, palm facing upward. The rain seemed to avoid him, the sheer aura of his presence holding back the storm. I want to give you my quirk, Izuku Midoriya. I want you to be my successor. The silence in the street was absolute. Izuku stared at the offered hand. This was it. The ultimate variable. The key to the kingdom. He had planned to fight his way to the top of Yue High School with nothing but his bare hands and his brain. He was fully prepared to do it. But to have the raw, unmatched power of the symbol of peace paired with his own hyperanalytical mind? Izuku didn't cry. He didn't drop to his knees in disbelief. He looked at All Might's hand, then looked at his own scarred, calloused knuckles. He looked at Katsuki, who was staring at him with a mixture of profound shock and an incredibly fierce, challenging grin. If Deku gets All Might's quirk, Katsuki's grin seemed to say, he'll finally be a worthy rival to crush. Izuku reached out. He didn't hesitate. He grasped All Might's skeletal hand firmly, his green eyes burning with a terrifying, unyielding determination. I accept your offer, All Might, Izuku said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. I will take One for All. And I will optimize it. All Might blinked, slightly taken aback by the boy's intensely clinical acceptance. Optimize it? Yes, Izuku nodded, already calculating. If the quirk stockpiles kinetic energy, then its output is directly proportional to the physical durability of the vessel. My current muscle density is high for my age, but insufficient for a massive influx of power. We have 10 months until the UA entrance exam. We need to completely restructure my training regimen. I require a caloric surplus of at least 4,000 calories a day, heavily weighted toward protein and complex carbohydrates. And we must increase my resistance training by a factor of 3. All Might stared at the boy, his jaw slightly slack. He had expected tears, emotional vows, perhaps a heartfelt speech. Instead, his new successor was already drafting a peer-reviewed athletic conditioning program in his head. All Might suddenly threw his head back and laughed, a genuine, booming sound that echoed down the empty street. Marvelous. Simply marvelous. All Might cheered. You are truly one of a kind, young Midoriya. We shall begin your training tomorrow at dawn. Dagoba Municipal Beach Park. Don't be late. As All Might turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city, Izuku stood there, the rain finally stopping. He looked down at his right hand, slowly clenching it into a fist. He had the brains. He had the brawn. And now, he had the power to change the world. Hey, Deku. Izuku turned. Katsuki was standing a few feet away. The explosive teen wasn't angry. He wasn't jealous. He looked utterly, violently thrilled. He slammed his fists together, a massive spark illuminating his feral grin. You better not die trying to use that power, you damn nerd, Katsuki warned, his voice vibrating with anticipation. Because when we get to UA, I'm going to beat you at your absolute best. No excuses? Izuku smiled, a sharp, confident expression that mirrored Katsuki's own. I look forward to the data, Kaken.